or challenging section on Shemitah. We're now back to the basic mitzvah, and we had learned that it's a 7-day mitzvah in the Mikdash and 1 day outside of the base of Mikdash, which the Gemara actually chose not to explore here. It's going to explore later. And then the issue about that would even be done on Shabbos if the first day Yantif fell out on Shabbos and everybody brought their lulavim to the Beit HaMikdash Beit HaKnesset. We'll get to Beit HaMikdash later, and the issue that you need to own it, whole issue of Matanam Nas Lahachzir, and so on around the issue of ownership. Actually, we are quite ahead. We're on Member Amud Aleph. On my mistake, we're in Member Amud Aleph at the Mishnah, so we're actually a good deal ahead. Let's take a look now. So then the last thing we did after that issue about ownership was the issue of that if you're in the process of doing a mitzvah and accidentally violate Shabbos as a result, the position of Rabbi Yossi that you're exempt from a korban, and then the question about what even if that's true, even if in the process you did not actually perform the mitzvah, like the case about bringing an animal that couldn't be used for a korban, and so on. Now we pick up at the Mishnah where we somewhat stay on the Shabbos theme. Let's take a look, and we wrap up this parak and begin the next one. So, middle of Member Amud Aleph. Mikabelas isha miyad bina miyad ba'ala. A woman can take the lulav from her husband and her son's hands. So clearly, just in terms of the context, suggests the idea that women would not take the lulav and esrog. We know they're not obligated, but certainly in Ashkenazi circles, the practice is, well, some do, some don't. But anyway, it's common enough for a woman to do it. The Mishnah suggests it would only be, of course, the males in practice who would do it. They would give over their lulavim after taking it to the men to their wives, or the sons to their mothers. And she can put it back into water on Shabbos because you'd be keeping it in water in order to keep it fresh. This is not something that's actually growing from the ground where there's a problem about watering it. So you're actually allowed to put it into like a pitcher of a container of water. Rabbi Yehuda says, "B'Shabbos machzirin." On Shabbos, you can return back into water it was already in. V'Yom Tov masifin. In Yantiv, you can even add fresh water. U'b'Moed machalifin. And on Chol Moed, you can even actually exchange the water. So Rashi even goes so further, says mitzvah lahachlif. I guess the mitzvah is in order to keep the lulav fresh. Now, exactly what the problem is not really spelled out in the Mishnah. Rashi basically just says that it's tircha, because again, it's not a problem of watering. It was a problem of watering. You couldn't even put it in, even in the existing water. But the question is, how much tircha do we allow on Shabbos? Exactly what the tircha is. I mean, okay, for us, what's the big tircha? You go and you fill it up from the sink. But I guess if you're drawing water, it's a bigger sense of a tircha, just involving yourself in this whole sort of process. But again, not exactly clear what the degree of the problem is. And again, interesting that the Gemara is going to completely skip over that part of the Mishnah. And it's going to hone in on the last line of the Mishnah, which is, Katan hayodea l'naneya chayav b'lulav. Once a minor knows how to shake the lulav, that's when he becomes obligated in the lulav. So this becomes, meaning it's a rabbinic obligation of chinuch, and as we're going to see in the Gemara, generally the idea of chinuch is from the when the child is able to do the act of the mitzvah. So the fact that the Mishnah phrases it in terms of when he's able to shake the lulav as opposed to when he's able to hold the lulav shows again the centrality of b'diavad. Even if you don't shake it, you're yotzei, but again shows the centrality of the shaking to the act of the mitzvah. I'll remind you that Tosfos pointed out that it doesn't say that he has to be able to say Hallel. So Tosfos from there wanted to infer that the saying of to the shaking of the lulav during Hallel was not so central. That I'm not so sure of. He could be at the shul when everybody else is saying Hallel, Shomea Ka'on, and whatnot. But anyway, certainly you see the centrality of the shaking. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Gemara says Pshita. Obviously, the woman can take it from her husband. Again, skipping over whatever it's telling me about the different Shabbos halachas, focusing just on the idea that the woman is taking it. So isn't that obvious? I might have thought that since a woman isn't obligated to take the lulav, so ema lo tikabel, maybe she shouldn't be able to take the lulav because maybe it's muktzah, it's just a stick as far as she's concerned. Kamash malan, that she is able to take it. Why? So Rashi says she's able to take it because it's not a stick for her husband. For her husband, it's a mitzvah object, so therefore it does not have a status of muktzah. Now again, for us, for Ashkenazim, that women can take it and make a bracha and so on, obviously it wouldn't be considered a stick vis-a-vis women either, because it would be a mitzvah object for them as well. But if the practice is that women, it would not be seen as a mitzvah for women, and women wouldn't take it, so the only reason it's not muktzah is because it's not muktzah for the husband. It does raise interesting questions about, what are the status of these things, like a lulav on Shabbos, Yantiv, or even, well, not Shabbos, let's talk about just a lulav on Yantiv, or a shofar on Yantiv, if you've already been Yosei the mitzvah. You have a similar mission about children who are blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and you allow them to sort of mitaskim behem, you allow them to blow the shofar, and so on. What if, they're not really doing the mitzvah? Is blowing the shofar, you can't usually play musical instruments on Yantiv, is blowing the shofar not in the context of a mitzvah prohibited on Rosh Hashanah, or on Rosh Hashanah itself, it's completely out of that category of being a muktzah object, or out of that category, of being like a musical instrument. How do you conceptualize it? Right. That's the verb. Right. Exactly. Exactly. So that's the point I raise here. A similar issue: is this fundamentally a muktzah issue or not? Does it get like it's an exclusion to that category because it is the mitzvah object for the day? You don't have to say that here again because Rashi says it's not it's at least a mitzvah object for men. But it's interesting thinking of the parallel between this and a similar discussion by shofar. Can you just fool around and blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Or is it no? When it's not being used for the mitzvah, then it is a problem of, let's say, a musical instrument or something of that nature. Okay, let's take a look now. Yes. Yeah. It's not limited to lulav. It means lulav and everything that's a part of it. Okay, so you saw that also before, right? It says that everybody would take their lulavs and bring it to the shul. I mean, it actually means their lulav and hadas and a rava and the esrog, right? Because everything had to be brought to the shul from beforehand. So now the Gemara says the following: Katan hayodei linaneya. Once a minor knows how to shake it, chayav lulav. So I'm sorry. So katan hayodei linaneya. So now we're going to have a braita that lists all the different sort of things that a minor, once he's able to do them, becomes obligated rabbinically, or we're obligated for him to train him in that mitzvah. So, and this is insignificant in talking, in as I said, indicating what is a central act for that mitzvah. So, Tana Rabbanan, Katan hayodei linanei chayav b'lulav. Once he knows how to wave, he is obligated, or we're obligated to teach him in the lulav. Once he's able to wrap himself in a garment, chayiv b'tzitzit, he's obligated in tzitzit. That's interesting, right? Because that's the bracha we make on a talis gadol, hitatef b'tzitzit. But you would think that the mitzvah is just to have the tzitzit on. But again, according to actually a number of geonim and rishonim, you're only obligated biblically in the mitzvah of tzitzis on a garment that actually is a bar ituf, something that you wrap around yourself and wrap around your head and so on. So that's again the centrality of ituf is indicated here. Lishmur tefillin. Now, once he's able to observe his tefillin, what does it mean observe it? So Rashi says it means that not to go into a bathroom with it. Although the bigger challenge is in the Gemara, and I guess as we know from some recent issues, is the issue about passing of gas. That tends to be a more challenging concern. So if he's able to do that, to wear his tefillin while keeping his body in the right sort of state, then Aviv lokeach lo tefillin, his father purchases for him tefillin. Now, it's again not that the idea of being shomer gufo is a central part to the mitzvah. This is actually a little different than the previous ones, because the previous ones are actually being able to do the act. Here it was sort of being, the act of tefillin, he might be able to do at a younger age, but you're not going to go ahead and start training him in tefillin if he's not able to preserve its sanctity. So this is not like the others, but this is a prerequisite for doing it, is making sure that he's able able to preserve the sanctity. Now, if you, by the way, you might notice a difference that by the tzitzit it says chayav b'tzitzit, chayav b'lulav, and here it doesn't say chayav b'tefillin. It says aviv lokeach lo tefillin, purchased tefillin for him. So if you look at the side at the on the left-hand margin, it has a note of that difference. It says gabi tzitzit lo naket lishna de lokeach to mistama yesh lo talit gabi lulav nami yacholatis b'lulav shel aviv, except I guess on the first day of Yontif. But the idea is that by tzitzis and lulav, you might, it's not so much about purchasing it. You might have an extra lulav around the house, or he could borrow the father's lulav, or by tzitzis he could put on, well, actually there's an issue about ownership by tzitzit. But anyway, the garment, which is fundamental, is the real central object you already have. But whereas here, the whole object has to be purchased initially, the buying of the tefillin, and therefore it is lokeach lo tefillin. That, by the way, of all these things, because of this issue about shomer gufo, is why we do not start training kids to put on tefillin until very soon before their bar mitzvah, right? You start training kids to put on tzitzis, like often they do at 3 years old, but they don't start, and lulav and esrog also at a younger age. But tefillin, you really wait till right before the bar mitzvah because of this concern of being able to make sure you are not passing gas while you are wearing it. So that is obviously clearly the central concern in this breita. Yodei l'daber. It's a little bit funny here in terms of the order in which this is going, because one assumes that Yodei l'daber comes before any of this stuff. Yodei l'daber aviv lomdo Torah. Once he knows how to speak, his father has to start teaching him Torah. It also might be different because teaching him Torah is not necessarily a mitzvah of chinuch. It might be the father's mitzvah of teaching his children Torah. V'shinantam levanecha. Okay? V'kriyat shema. And begin training him in the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, which clearly is the son's mitzvah. So, Torah Mahi, what is the mitzvah of Torah that the father trains him with? So, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Torah Tzivalanu Moshe Morashat Kilat Yaakov. So that's very beautiful if you think about that is the first line of Torah that is taught, which is the idea that, the Torah comes from God, through Moshe, but it's not even mentioning God, it's mentioning Moshe and a morasha, a sense of a bequest, an inheritance, right? So the sense of Masorah and tradition, and here you have one generation teaching the next, the father teaching the child, and the very first thing you teach it is the nature to which Torah is, actually this handed down tradition, which is then being sort of continued through this teaching. So I just find that very powerful that is the first thing. Now it's interesting to note, it doesn't even mention, by the way, that it comes from God, Torah Tzivalanu Moshe. But so again, the power of sort of the role that you're playing in the tradition and handing it down is very central in that teaching. Now, it's actually interesting in the Rambam, because I'm just pulling this up here, the way the Rambam brings down what the first thing is. The Rambam very characteristically. Hold on, let me just pick up the Rambam. Okay. So, and then Kriyat Shema, we'll read another line. Kriyat Shema Mahi, what's Kriyat Shema? What training does he begin doing? Pasuk Risha, the first verse, right? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So that's training him in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah and in the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. Now the Rambam, when he brings it down, says, you could say he's just quoting the Gemara, but I think he's doing something a little bit different. The Rambam says like this, when he talks about the mitzvah of Torah, Mi'emasayich aviv chayv l'lamdo Torah, Mishiyatchil l'daber melamdo Torah tzivalanu Moshe u'shma Yisrael. So that the Rambam does is he folds in the Shema Yisrael not into the mitzvah of chinuch of Kriyat Shema, but into the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And did you hear? I mean, he just said the father teaches in Torah, which is Torah Tzivalanu and Shema Yisrael, and then he keeps on teaching him more and more and more, etc. So I think the Rambam anyway just goes according to his general approach, where for the Rambam, you see the Rambam bringing in the sort of centrality of dogma and faith issues in many circumstances where the Gemara doesn't have it. So, for example, the Gemara says, what is it that you teach a prospective convert? The Gemara says you teach him the light mitzvahs, the heavy mitzvahs, only discusses mitzvahs. The Rambam, when he reframes it, says, what do you teach this prospective convert? You teach him about belief in God and the prohibition of idolatry, and you spend a lot of time talking about that. And you also teach him a little bit about the mitzvahs, but don't spend too much time on that. So it's it's quite interesting that I think that the Rambam does the same thing here. That although the Gemara is talking about chinuch for two mitzvos, Torah and Shema, the Rambam says if you start teaching him Torah, sure, you say HaTorah Tziva Lanu Moshe, but you also say Shema Yisrael. Like before, the basic first thing you start teaching him, even in the context of teaching him like Torah, which is Torah, like knowledge of the religion, is the Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So I think the Rambam is folding them in together because he doesn't want to see that just as a mitzvah of Shema, but as sort of, you can't start the teaching without bringing God into the equation. Okay, now back to the Gemara. Hayodea lishmor gufo. Once a minor knows how to observe, protect, guard his body. This is not like by the tefillin in terms of passing gas. This is in terms of encountering things that are tamei and not touching tamei things. Then ochlin al gufo taharot. Then you can, if his body touched things that are tahor, you can nevertheless go ahead and eat it because you can actually trust him to be good and careful at doing that. So that's actually quite fascinating. It's one thing to say, as a minor, you're of the age, we can start training you, even as saying, we believe you're good enough at guarding, at not passing gas, that will start having you put on tefillin. It's another thing to say, whoa, before I eat any of the stuff you've touched, I got to be 100% sure. Like, I'm not going to trust you. You're just a kid. So what's actually quite fascinating is, no, once he gets to the age where he really can be trusted in that, then even if he winds up touching your tahor truma, you can go ahead and eat it. You can trust him. He does not have to be an adult. Of course, what exactly you define as the threshold for saying he's able to be shomer gufo is not spelled out. But once he reaches that, even without an adult, you can eat truma and tahor things that he has touched. Lishmur et yadav. Now, it's one thing to watch that your body doesn't encounter tuma. Hands are considered to be like, you don't pay attention to where your hands are and what things they're touching, and that's a higher level to say that you even can guard where your hands are going. But once he's at the level that he can protect and watch where his hands are touching, then ochlin al yadav tarot. Even if his hands touch tahor things, then you can trust it if he's at that, and eat them if he's at that level that he can watch his hands. If you can ask him, if he's aware enough that you can ask him, hey, there was some truma here in the middle of the street, did you see if anything touched it? And if he's able to actually give an intelligent answer and will be able to sort of accurately pay attention to those things and respond appropriately, then if he says something did touch it, something tamei, then it's tamei. If he said nothing touched it, it's tahor. Let's say he says, I'm not sure. I was here, I was seeing it, I don't know. So then the halacha is, there's a general principle by Tum and Tahara, that if there's a doubt in Reshut HaRabim, whether something touched, tamei things touch something tahor, we say that in a doubt, sveiko tahor. If there's a doubt in Reshut HaYachid, then we say sveiko tamei. If you're not sure, then you assume it's tamei. So if he's of the age where he could give a yes or a no answer, and he says, I don't know, then you apply the general rule of doubts are tamei in Reshut HaYachid, they're tahor in Reshut HaRabim. Of course, the question is, then what difference does it make? What difference does it make how old he is and what he's able to do? Once he says, I don't know, so you go by the general rule. I don't know in Rishus HaRabim is Tamei, is Tahor, and Rishus HaYachid is Tamei. What do you mean? Once he's able to be asked, then here's what you do if he doesn't know. So the actual interesting halacha is it does matter. Because if somebody is so young that they cannot give a reasonable answer to the question, then even in Rishus HaYachid, a doubt is Tahor. The rule that in Rishus HaYachid, a doubt is Tamei is only if there's somebody who should know, who should be able to know and doesn't know. Now that sounds a little bit bizarre, but let me tell you where we learn out this principle from. Where do we learn out this principle that a doubtful tumah in Rishus HaYachid is tamei? Well, we learn it out from another area that is labeled tumah, but it's really not about the same type of tumah. It's about a woman who is suspected of committing adultery. And the point is that the woman goes in private with a man, and her husband has already warned her, I don't want to see you in private with this man. And anyway, she goes in private with the man, and then the question is, what is her status? She now has a doubtful status about whether she's committed adultery. So if she went in private, which is a yachid, then she's forbidden to her husband until you do the whole sota ritual. If it was a public, which is a rabbin, she's not forbidden. So from there we learn this principle that doubtful tumah, then we abstract it to a completely different world, but it has the same label as tumah, is tamei in Reshut HaYachid. But here's the logic. The reason that the doubt is there is because there was somebody there, meaning part of the problem of the Reshut HaYachid and the reason she's doubtfully tamei. Well, one, it was the opportunity to sin, right? They were in private. But the other point is that like people have that information and aren't sharing it. Like she knows what happened, the man knows what happens, or maybe they are sharing it, but we don't believe them. So part of the idea that doubtful tumah and Reshut HaYachid is tamei is because there's a sense like we that there's information to be had that's not forthcoming, and the fact that we say that she's forbidden, this is like the halacha sota. The idea behind it is hopefully that creates a type of a pressure, that's a motive to actually come forth and produce the evidence. So that seems to be why the idea is limited to a case where it's a Reshut HaYachid where somebody in theory could know. So therefore you say Sveiko Tame, right? You understand how that sort of parallels the Sota case. We're going to give you a very, sort of strict status until we find out the information that we think is accessible to us. Because in Reshut HaYachid, because there were people there who could know, and we want to get a hold of the information. So same type of an idea here. If it's in Reshut HaYachid, it's forbidden, it's tamei, if in theory that knowledge was knowable. Somebody was there who could, in theory, have known about it. Whereas if the knowledge wasn't knowable, if there was nobody there, or the only person there was a person that was so young, they were ignorant and would not be able to give a reasonable response, then we would actually not say tamei. Then we would actually just go by the normal halacha or the halacha that a suffix is tahor. So therefore, it matters that this kid, only once he's at the age where he could, in theory, give a good answer, do we say that a doubt in Reshut HaYachid is tamei. Okay, so now we continue. Hayodea lifros kapav. Once he knows how to duchen, how to literally spread out his hands if he's a kohen, chokin lo truma beveis hagranot. You can actually give him truma at the granary, meaning he shows up to my threshing floor, and here he is. He's a kohen. He's a minor. Okay, he's 10 years old, but he in shul when it's time for duchening, he does the duchening. So therefore, I can now give him grain at the in my granary. If, however, he doesn't duchen in public, then even though he's a kohen and he can maybe make sure he doesn't eat it betuma because maybe he's of the age that he protects himself from betuma, I don't give him the truma in public at the threshing floor. I can send it to his house. He can eat it in his house, but I don't give it to him in public. What's the difference? Either way, we're trusting him to eat the truma and eat it properly. The difference is that in one case, he already is publicly recognized as a kohen. He gets up and he does the duchening. And also we have to understand that they were not doing the duchening just on, the Yomi Tovim. They were doing it every day, like the Sfardim, which is what the Gemara says. So here he is, he duchens every day in public. People know he's a kohen. So there's no problem with me, therefore, giving him the truma in public, as long as, again, he can make sure to eat it in the right way. But if he's not publicly acknowledged as a kohen yet, and I'm giving it to him, then that will be very confusing for the community and confusing for him or whatever. Here, people will think I gave it to him and they won't realize he's a kohen. So only once he's doing it in public can I then go ahead and give him the grain in public as well. You'll realize, by the way, the end of this list has nothing to do with chinuch. The beginning was about chinuch, but now we're also dealing with with other aspects. I mean, tefillin was an interesting crossover. On the one hand, he would be able to do it earlier, but on the other hand, we don't trust him to do it until he gets to a later age. And a lot of these things here also has to do with questions about trust and knowledge, and general status in halachic areas, ritual halachic areas, not really about chinuch, not at all limited to questions about mitzvos and chinuch. So you had a question?
Yeah, I did. The concept of machshava, if you learn about chinuch, is learned from Maser and then Maser. Machshava apply also with just the Stam Yisrael that wants to, give a portion as truma, like you can do it on your machshava also.
Yeah, he's mafresh his truma by machshava ba'alma, but that's it comes up in other places and gittin and whatnot. But yes, I mean, look, it's always a question in the Rishonim when the Gemara says machshava if it means articulated or unarticulated machshava. Okay, so anyway, so now the Gemara says like this: Hayodea lishchot, top of Membet, Amid Bet. Once he knows how to slaughter, you can eat his shchita. Amar Rav Huna, v'hu shegadol omer al gabav. That's only if he's being observed at the time to make sure he doesn't make a mistake. Now, this is an interesting question, what hayodea lishchot means. Rashi says, if you look at Rashi, hayodea lishchot, la'amein yadav lishchita. He knows how to basically. He knows the physical skill of shechting. He doesn't have to. He doesn't have to have a test. Pass a test on knowledge of laws of shechita, right? But theoretical is not enough. Is not sufficient. But not only is it not sufficient, it's also not necessary. You can observe and watch to make sure that the laws were followed, but you have to make. But what he needs to do is he has to have actually the actual physical skill. Okay, so that's what the next Rashi says. Mutter lechom mishchitato k'amar Rav Huna v'hu shegadol omed al gabav ra shelo shahav lo daras. You're observing to make sure the laws are followed. Okay, now you could have said the opposite. You could have said maybe he needs to know the laws because maybe there are things that are not observable, and in terms of the physical ability to do it, that you can observe, right? Why is it that Rashi assumes that the things that are observable to you are the following of the laws, but the things that you aren't necessarily observable, or that you can't trust your observation, is its actual physical skill? Tosfos points out this question. If you look at Tosfos, Hayodea Lishchot, Tosfos says, "Le'amen yadav l'shchita, alfa pi she'eino baki b'hilchot shchita, muter lecho mishchitato." He's first just quoting Rashi. Mashma, it sounds from Rashi, if he's, if he does not have the physical skill to train and to guide his hands, l'shchita, then even if he was fully observed, because maybe there are things you miss. Maybe he his hand trembled for a second, or maybe there's just a concern that it'll lead to too many treifas and it'll be a waste of meat. But again, there's an interesting question: which part are you supplementing by your observation? Right. So according to Tosfos, is just spelling out what's implicit in Rashi, that your observation is not sufficient if he does not actually know physically how to do it well. Okay, if he has the physical skill, then you can supplement through your observation to make sure that the laws were followed. Again, you could have said you needed to observe both, or you could have said that, anyway, you could have said the exact reverse. But that's the way Rashi is explaining the Gemara. This is not a chinuch question. This is like the issue about, can I trust you that you were tahor when you touched my grain? You're not being mechanech him in some mitzvah that he has to be doing when he's an adult. It's not about training him to be a responsible Jewish adult. It's about trusting him to act properly within certain halachic areas.
What I meant by that, I understand what you're saying. What I meant to suggest by that is that the criterion for becoming chayav in these other mitzvot was the developmental capability of physically doing the action. Right. As opposed to a theoretical understanding of the reasons of the action.
That is true.
There's an emphasis on the behavioral.
That is true. That's a good point. All of these things are not about sort of theoretical knowledge. They're about some of them do require a certain amount of theoretical knowledge, like to watch yourself not to become tamei, means you have some awareness of what are tamei things that are out there. Right. But you are correct that the common denominator here is not about having some information in your head, but being able to have a certain ability physically to do certain things or an awareness of certain things. That is true.
The implication then is that to learn Torah requires you to ask questions. Because
why?
Because it doesn't say as soon as he can hear. It says as soon as he can speak.
Well, okay, but that's an interesting point. That
I understand about the Shema.
Right, I'm not sure, but I would say questions. It might have the idea of articulated Torah. That learning Torah is also saying Torah. There is an interesting debate, do you make Birchas HaTorah before you think Torah, or only after or only before you say it? Now, part of that has to do with the question of the nature of Birchas HaTorah. It might not be enough to do a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. You actually need a thing to relate to. So you need some speech, something sort of materialized. But it's a good point. I would not have identified the speaking as because you want him to be asking. I think the ability to ask questions. It's true. Kids ask questions basically as soon as they begin to speak, so they're not really at separate stages. But I was assuming it was more about the idea of saying it out loud, like "V'shinantam levanecha." The next phrase is "V'dibarta bam," right? "B'shiftecha bebeitecha." So that was more my assumption, but it's an interesting thought about that. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Amar Rav Huna, we just did that. Yochel lecho, back to the bright. Yochel lecho kizayis tagan. Once he can eat a kizayis of grain, like any of the grain products, marchiki mitzawato umimei raglav. You have to distance yourself if you're like going to daven or so on, or say Shema, from his excrement and from his urine, because that's when it starts being smelly. This actually is a very relevant halacha. When kids are still very young and they're still just nursing from their parents, they've dirty diaper or whatever, you don't really have to be in a different room when you're davening, because the excrement only gets smelly once they start eating cereal and baby, right? Even the baby formula isn't yet cereal, isn't yet grain. Okay. Interesting that it also applies to the urine and not just to the excrement. Okay. Amar Rav Chizda v'hu sheyochel lecho b'chtei achilas pras. That's now we're getting very formalistic about it. It's not enough that he's able to eat grain products, but he can eat a kezayis in the time it takes to eat achilas pras. Which is the normal definition of an act of eating. Why being able to do what halachically is called an act of eating, in order to say that the excrement is smelly and problematic, is not so clear. But anyway, Amar Rav Chia Braid Rav Yeva ubegadol afa pisha inu yochel lecho b'chtei achilas pras. And here then comes the irony: by an adult, even if he's like maybe he's very old and he can't eat so much, he's obviously eating grain, but only over a longer period of time will he be able to get down into kazayas. It's still a problem, the excrement. Tichsiv v'yosef da'as yosif machov, and one who adds knowledge adds travails. So somehow you get older and your excrement gets smellier. I don't know. Anyway, okay, I'm sure there's truth to that, but it's interesting the link to the psukim. Yochel lecho kezayis tzli. Once he's able to eat a kezayis, an olive's worth of roasted meat, shochtin alavas haPesach, he can be part of the group that's counted for the korban Pesach. Shenemar ish l'fiach lo, person according to their eating, but you have to be able to eat a minimum amount, and a Pesach is eaten roasted, and roasted. It's it takes an older. You have to have more developed teeth to be able to eat roasted meat than like you have to do like soft and cooked meat.
It's interesting though. It says ish.
Right. Well, that's true, and we don't limit it to each. That's true. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Achi yochel levarer achila. Only once he's able to identify food. Meaning, what does that mean? Keitzad nosim lo tzror v'zarko egoz v'not lo. If you give him a rock, he looks at the rock, he throws it away. He wants a rock. But if it's a nut, like a walnut, it's a walnut. He takes it. He understands that it's food, and he's going to crack it open and eat it. Now, why exactly that's important for Korban Pesach, I don't know. It seems a little bit that it's a difference between eating and being fed. Right? So if you're able yourself to discern this is the food, this is not food, I throw this away, I eat this, you're the one who's doing the eating. Whereas if you put it in his mouth and he can chew it and swallow it, that's more of a reality of being fed than a reality of what we would call eating. And that seems to be Rabbi Yehuda's position. So that was a fascinating end, having all this issues of minors about the question about chinuch for the lulav, completely jumping over the yontav issue and the putting the thing in water. Now we begin. So we did basically the first three prakim. The first two were devoted to the sukkah, 1.5 to the actual physical shape of the sukkah, and the last half of it to the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah. Similarly, the third parak was devoted to the lulav, hadas harav, and esrog, where it was devoted to the physical qualities of it. But towards the end, we got to the question of the actual act of taking it, where notice, by the way, it didn't mention a bracha, didn't mention just holding on to it. It emphasized the shaking of it and the shaking of it during Hallel, and then it turned us into some interesting side discussions about Shemitah, but again, then about taking of it in Shul and on a Yontif that falls out on Shabbos, etc. Now we have the fourth parak. Really, in a way, we'll touch again on some of those themes, but you'll see the way it's structured. It sort of looks at all of the various mitzvot that are noeg on Sukkot and sort of discusses them like sort of in a more collective type of a way or in a differently organized way. So let's take a look. All right. So it says the following. Let me just see one thing here. The other thing we did. Okay, so it says Lulav ve'arava shisha v'shiva. the mitzvah of lulav and the mitzvah of arava. We haven't even mentioned the mitzvah of arava. We know that we do the hoshanas, right, with the lulav. It's called here the mitzvah of arava because although we walk around and do the hoshanas holding the lulav and the esrog, the center part of that ritual is the arava part of it. So that applies sometimes 6 days, sometimes 7 days of Sukkot. The issue here of all of these things, which are sometimes, X and sometimes X minus 1 or X plus 1, is the issue of Shabbos. Where does Shabbos fall out? Okay, sometimes Shabbos falls out to take away a day, and sometimes it doesn't. So, Hallel v'asimcha, saying Hallel and rejoicing. Now, rejoicing here specifically has the context of Shlamei Simcha, bringing Shlamim in the Beit HaMikdash, which is a mitzvah to bring on the Chagim. Okay, those apply Shmona. For all 8 days of Sukkot, you are saying Hallel, including Shmini Atzeret, and you are bringing the Shlamei Simcha. You're bringing them also all 8 days, or you bring. We'll see in a minute that we'll see soon that you might bring it on day 7 and you eat it on day 8. But anyway, those are things that are done all 8 days. Sukkah, v'nisu chamayim, sitting in the sukkah, and the pouring of water that they did in the Beis HaMikdash, that they did with the morning sacrifices. The only time they did this was on Sukkot. That would be Shiv'ah, the 7 days of Sukkot. You sit in a sukkah all 7 days, and you do the pouring of the water all 7 days. Hachalil, the playing via flute, chamisha. Is a chalil a flute or is it a recorder? It's a wind instrument, right? Flute? Okay, so flute. So the playing, I don't know.
They're the same.
They're somewhat different. I don't know. All right. There's some type of a wind instrument. Anyway, the Chalil for 5, Chamisha V'Shisha. What does that mean? It means that this is the music that you would play to accompany the Simchas Beisar Shoeva. Now, you don't play music on Shabbos and you don't play it on Yontif. So if you think about it, you have the 7 days of Sukkot. So you start with -1 for the first day of Yontif. At most, you're going to get 6. And if Shabbos falls out in the middle of the week rather than on Yontif, you're down to 5. Okay, so that's why that is 5 and 6. Now we're going to go back and unpack it from the beginning. Lulav Shiva Ketzad. Where do you have Lulav? We said Lulav and a Rava could be 6 or 7. So we'll worry about a Rava, which is the first we're hearing in the Mishnah here that there's a mitzvah of a Rava. But we'll worry about that in a minute. Let's first wrap up the Lulav discussion. So how would Lulav be a 7-day mitzvah? Well, obviously the 7 days of Sukkot. Well, what about Shabbos? Well, you'll remember, what did we just say in the last daf? That if Shabbos falls out on the first day of Yontif, they would take the lulav on Shabbos Yontif. So if Shabbos, not in the Mikdash, the Mishnah said that they would go ahead and they prepare it in the shuls, and they'd go to the shuls and they would take it, right? You remember that Mishnah, right? Not our practice, but the Mishnah we learned yesterday says you would take lulav on Shabbos when it fell out on the first day Yontif. So that's how you could get all 7 days taking the lulav. It would be 6 days if Shabbos fell out during Chol HaMoed. But if Shabbos fell out on Yontif, then you would take it all 7 days. That's what we just learned. Okay, Ketzad. Yontif Arishon Shel Chag Shechal Lios B'Shabbos. If the first day of Yontif falls out on a Shabbos, Lo Shiva, you would take it on 7 days. You'd even take it on Shabbos if it was the first day of Yontif. For Shar Kol Hayamim, however, if Shabbos was not on Yontif, if Shabbos fell out during the rest of the week, then Shisha, then you do not take it on Shabbos Chol HaMoed, but you would take lulav on Shabbos Yontif. Arava Shiva Ketzad. Now we get to this mitzvah of Arava, which for us translates as the Hoshana. Okay, so Arava Shiva Ketzad. So how is that done all 7 days? So where were we? Arava Shiva Ketzad. Yom Shvi'i Shel Arava Shechal Yos B'Shabbos. If the 7th day of Arava, what do we call the 7th day of Sukkot? Everybody? 7th day of Sukkot? Hoshana Rabbah, thank you. Okay, so if Hoshana Rabbah, which was the major day, the same way the first day of Sukkot is the day for the primary day for Lulav, it's the day where there's a biblical mitzvah for Lulav. Day 7 of Sukkot is the day for Arava. It's Hoshana Rabbah. So you would even do the Aravas on Shabbos, if Hoshana Rabbah fell out on Shabbos, the same way you would do Lulav on Shabbos if the first day fell out on Shabbos. Okay, so Yom Shvi Shel Arava Shechalios b'Shabbos. If the seventh day of Arava, Hoshana Rabbah, fell out on Shabbos, Arava Shiva, you would even do it on Shabbos. V'Shar Kol Yamim, but the rest of the time, if Shabbos fell out during the week, not on Hoshana Rabbah, then Shisha, you would not take it on Shabbos. So would you take Lulav on Shabbos? Yes, if the first day was Shabbos, because that's the biblical mitzvah. Would you take a Rava? Would you do Hoshana Rabbah on Shabbos? Would you do a Ravas on Shabbos? Yes. If the seventh day was Shabbos, if Hoshana Rabbah was Shabbos, you would even do it on Shabbos. Okay. Now, mitzvahs lulav ketzad. Now, although we a minute ago, in the previous parak, described how they would do lulav and how they would do it on Shabbos, that they would take their stuff to the Beit Knesset ahead of time, this Mishnah goes back and revisits that. What would be the mitzvah of the lulav? How would it play out? Yontav Arishon Shechad Shechalios b'Shabbos. First day Yontav falls out on Shabbos. Okay, we just had that before. Malichin es lulavim lahar habayis. So before we discussed what they would do outside of the Beis Hamikdash. They would bring their lulavim and esrogim to the shoals erev Shabbos. Here we're talking what they would do if you were planning on going to the Beis Hamikdash, and it was first day Yontav and Shabbos. So before Shabbos, you would bring your lulavim to the Temple Mount. The chazanim mikabli mehen, and the chazanim, the sextons, would take it from you. They'd be like the people that would be, the functionaries there who are handling this stuff. They would take everybody's lulav and esrog, the whole thing. V'sodrino san agabe itztaba, and they would place it on top of the itztaba, the portico. So Rashi says, what does that mean? I mean, if it was on top of like the roof, then it would dry out in the sun. Rashi actually says it means like it would be on the top of the chairs that had that they were that there was this courtyard in front, and there would be like with like a roof, sort of on top of it, and they would put it on the benches that would be under the roof. Okay, to shade it from the sun. Right. Okay. So right, Rashi says like it was a particular like square, like a courtyard in front, on Har Habayis. Okay, so they would put it on these benches. The elder people had a right to put their lulavim and esrogim in a special chamber. So as we're going to see, they won't have to fight with all the masses. Okay, so and you teach people to say, anybody who happens to take my lulav, it's theirs as a gift, because this goes back to the concern that you have to own your lulav and esrog. Now, if you remember, it said before that, it said when they put it in the shul before Shabbos, everybody would come on Shabbos and recognize which was theirs. Okay, but a shul has what? 50 people, 100 people? I mean, they didn't have huge shuls like we have nowadays. But in the Beis Hamikdash, it's going to be a crazy number of people, so you can't assume you're going to find your own. So therefore you say, I'm giving mine as a gift to whoever picks it up. Now what would happen? The next morning, Shabbos morning, people would rise up early and come. You'd want to rise up early because you'd want to beat the crowd and find your own. The chazanim zorkino sam lifneihem. Now that does not seem to be a very orderly way of doing it. The chazanim would just throw the lulavim down in front of all the masses. And say, here, go find your lulav. And people would grab and hitting one another to try to get either theirs or probably to get the best lulav there. Okay, and it would be a whole huge balagan. So, once the Beis Din saw that it was leading to people's being endangered, they said, you know what? Why doesn't everybody just take it at home if it falls out on Shabbos? Don't come to the Beis Hamikdash and do it. Now, of course, does it mean literally Beito? We learned in the previous Mishnah that they would bring it to the shoals as well. So after they made this takana not to do it on Har Habayis, did they also tell people don't bring it to shoals and just stay at home over Shabbos? How does what we're learning here about what happened at the Temple Mount affect what they were doing outside of the temple, where we do not find that it got to these types of fights? It's also quite fascinating, like I said, just to wonder, really? You were describing this whole beautiful procedure and it ended by saying, and they threw it in front of them? You couldn't have figured out any more reasonable way of organizing this process? You couldn't have done it like by last name. You couldn't have called them up by rows. You could have done nothing. And and again, it reminds you of the whole story that we learned in Yoma, right? When they would have a race to the top of the Mizbeach of who would get to do Trumas Hadesh, and they push people off, they'd fight, but then the takana was that they would make like a lottery. They came up with a more organized way of doing it, as opposed to just saying we're not even going to bother doing it. So it's quite fascinating, like how it led to that in the first place, and then what the response was. The other thing,
thought that it really didn't matter if you didn't get your own.
right?
What happened to that?
Well, I didn't say that they were fighting to find their own. Maybe they were just they might have just been fighting. They might have been fighting to get the best, as opposed to get their own. Number one, and number two is it might just have been that there were too many people all at once, and everybody's just pushing and shoving. So anyway, you hear about people getting crushed after like rock concerts and whatever. I mean, just the mass of people. But anyway, the other interesting thing that somebody asked, and I don't know the answer to, somebody must talk about it, is why do they need to do all this? They were in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim was a walled city, So I don't understand why you couldn't just bring your thing from home. Somebody must talk about that. But yes. Yes, totally. We have found excavated, yes. And certainly, first of all, even, not everybody lived in the environs of the temple and could come to the temple. But even relatively close, just because you lived near the temple didn't mean you were going there on a regular basis. Yeah, they definitely had shows. We have literary and archaeological evidence of that. Not bummos, except in the first base of Mikdash, not in the second.
There's particularly in this Mishnah, such a emphasis on the lulav is one thing, the arava is another thing.
Right.
But every single time I see the word lulav, we're assuming all four.
All four minim, sure. Because if they had to bring it before Shabbos, you had to bring everything.
So when
you even had to bring the esrog. That's the funny thing, is that it's one thing to make the bracha on tilas lulav and so on, but
But when it says lulav,
Toz already indicated. I mean, the Gemara said, that they brought an. Well, what did it say? Did it say when it said that they were coming that he brought what it says 1,000 zuz for his lulav? What did it say for his esrog? No, it says lulav cost 1,000 zuz. But one wonders, does it mean the lulav or does it mean the whole thing? Right. It is funny that its rogim aren't being mentioned here.
This Mishnah, lulav clearly means all four.
The whole pack.
But arava means just the arava.
Exactly. Yeah, that is true. All right, let's take a look at the Gemara. Amai, says the Gemara, tiltu ba'almahu v'lidchi Shabbos. So the Gemara says, look, it's dealing with the fact that the Mishnah is basically saying the only time you would take lulav on Shabbos is if Shabbos was on Yontiv, right? The first day Yontiv was, Shabbos was the first day Yontiv. Then we would allow, now we don't even do that. But in the Mishnah, as we've seen, that's when they would do it, when Shabbos and first day Yontiv coincided. Why couldn't you take lulav on Chol HaMoed Shabbos, right? What would be the big deal? It's just muktzah. You're doing a mitzvah. Let the mitzvah override a mitzvah concern. Maybe it even shouldn't be considered muktzah. So the Gemara says, Amai tiltu ba'amahu v'lidchi Shabbos, let it override Shabbos, even if it's Chol HaMoed. Now this gets to the issue I mentioned to you. The phrase is let it override Shabbos. Why don't we say if it's a mitzvah, it's not even muktzah today? So if you look at Tosfos, Joseph just has a line on that. He says, tiltu ba'almahu, Tosfos says, avagav dechazi lemitzvah. What do you mean it's muktzah? If that's your only concern, it shouldn't even be muktzah. You're using it for a mitzvah. Shaykh be isser muktzah l'tilto, me'achar dein asoi kli. Etc. So he has that interesting discussion. Is the lulav considered to be muktzah? It's just you're allowed to take it because of the mitzvah, right? Or is it not fundamentally not considered to be muktzah altogether? This Gemara makes it sound that it fundamentally, it could be if it was just Yontiv, muktzah applies on Yontiv as well. So it could be if it's just Yontiv, we don't call it muktzah, right? Forget Shabbos, it's just first day Yontiv. So is my lulav muktzah today? No, maybe we say, come on, it's Yontiv, Sukkah, it's not muktzah vis-a-vis Yontiv. But how about vis-a-vis Shabbos? If I had this lulav on any other day of Shabbos, it would be muktzah, right? If it was any other Shabbos of the year. So maybe even on Shabbos Yontiv, even if we were allowed to take the lulav, it's still overriding muktzah. It doesn't stop being muktzah. A fascinating issue is can you consider the lulav to be muktzah on Shabbos Yontiv, or is it fundamentally not muktzah? Okay, this Gemara sounds like it is muktzah, but it says fine, let it be muktzah, but who cares? It's Shabbos Chol HaMoed. It's a mitzvah. You should override muktzah and take your lulav. Amai tiltu ba'almahu. It's just a problem of moving, which is the Gemara's phrase for muktzah. The Lidchi Shabbos, you should still be able to take it on Chol HaMoed Shabbos. Why not? Amar Rabba, says Rabba, Gzeira Shema Yitlenu Biyado V'yedichetzel Baki Liomod. Because you're right, it's not a concern of muktzah, it's a concern that that it'll lead to carrying. You'll pick it up, you'll go to an expert to learn how to do it. Why do you need an expert? Well, maybe to teach you how to do the shaking, because we discussed the shaking before, and maybe just to learn how to make the bracha. So you'll go to somebody to teach you about it. V'yavirenu, top of Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, Arba Amos B'Rishus Harabim, and you'll come to carry it 4 Amos in Rishus Harabim. So you're right. The reason you don't do it on Chol HaMoed, we're going to talk about in a minute why you do it even what our story is with Yantav. But the reason you don't do it on Shabbos Chol HaMoed is it'll lead to accidental carrying, and that's a reasonable concern because we see all the previous Mishnayot talk about the steps you have to do to prevent carrying, how you'd bring it to the shul ahead of time, how you'd bring it to the Beit HaMikdash ahead of time. So Rabbi says, you see those concerns about carrying? That's why we don't let you do it on Shabbos Chol HaMoed, because it'll lead to accidental carrying. The Hainu time of the shofar, the Hainu time of the Megillah. And that's the reasoning, this is presumably what the Gemara is adding, why we don't blow shofar on Shabbos, and why we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos, because it'll lead to carrying. Now this, by the way, we should take a minute out just to pause and recognize this. If you've ever learned this, you'll say, why don't we blow the shofar on Shabbos? Why don't we take the lulav on Shabbos? Right? The answer is, well, we don't ask the Megillah question because it only comes up if you're living in Yerushalayim or in a walled city. But anyway, the answer is, because we're afraid you'll come to carry it. That explanation is first articulated by Rabbi in an Amora. It's not in the Mishnayot. The Mishnayot assume you don't do it on Shabbos, but they don't say why not. Okay, it's only Rabbi that gives the reason that you might come to carry. Now, by lulav and shofar, you could understand a reason independent of a concern of carrying. By lulav, it could be a muktzah idea. Yes, it's true, we should allow it, it's a mitzvah and so on, but you do understand that there's some idea that fundamentally is conflicting with this concept of Shabbos. And by shofar, it's playing of a musical instrument. So it could be that there was, it wasn't just a gezerah. One of the interesting things is that the Bavli often tends to explain things based on a gezerah. We don't let you do this lest it come to do something else. Although in the Mishnayot, that's often not spelled out, and it could be that things are seen more as intrinsic problems rather than as a problem of where it will lead. So one could have imagined that the problem of a shofar on Shabbos or a lulav on Shabbos was not just a concern it'll lead to carrying. Maybe it was just like, it's not so Shabbostic to be taking a stick. It's not so Shabbostic to be blowing a shofar. It's not appropriate for a Shabbos. Now, why would that tell me not to do a biblical mitzvah? Okay, so Rabbah tries to give a bigger concern out there. It might lead to a violation. But again, it is worth noting that concern is not spelled out. That was Rabbah. But again, Rabbah certainly by lulav picking up on the hint of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah does speak about bringing it to the shul ahead of time, bringing it to the Beis HaMikdash ahead of time. We just had a discussion of Rabbi Yossi. You accidentally carried it on Shabbos, you're exempt from a korban. So we totally see in the Mishnayot the high possibility or concern that doing it on Shabbos can lead to carrying. So Rab is saying that's what's behind why we don't do it on Chol HaMoed. But he says that by lulav. The Gemara then extends it to shofar and Megillah, which again, not only was not in the Mishnah, but wasn't even part of the original statement of Rabbah. So it is just worth appreciating where these ideas develop. So let's just read one more line. Ihachi, says the Gemara, if that's true, that is a concern that you'll come to carry it and you don't do it on Shabbos, Yom Rishon Nami. So we shouldn't even do it when the first day Yontiv is Shabbos, you'll come to carry it. But it says, no, Rishon Hatakinu Rabbanan Beveso. No, we're not afraid you'll carry it on the first day, because after the Takana, we told everybody to keep it, to take lulav at home. So you're told you have to take it at home, so nobody's going to come to carry it. So the Gemara says, 1 minute. The Gemara says, Kodem takana Michael Meimar, but fine. That's after that whole big thing happened in the Beis HaMikdash, and they said do it at home. But before that happened, they were still okay with people taking it on the first day. Right? Generally, it was very clear. They always would take it on the first day. At a certain stage, because of fighting in the Beis HaMikdash, they said, do it at home. But how did it start that you let people take it on the first day? And we learned the previous Mishnah. They would bring it to the shul ahead of time. Clearly, you're not taking it at home. Why are we allowing it on the first day and not concerned about the Shabbos concern that Rabbah says? So the Gemara says like this: Ella Rishon de Isa Minatora Big Vulin, the first day, which is biblical, not only in the Beis HaMikdash, but all places. Lo gazru b'Rabbanan. They let you still take it on the first day. They weren't going to override the biblical mitzvah. Hanach, the other days, the less new minatar bigvulin, that they're not biblical out of the Beis Hamikdash. Gazru b'Rabbanan. They did not let you take it on Shabbos, even in the Beis Hamikdash. Although in the Beis Hamikdash it's biblical for all 7 days, the other days are weaker. They're only Beis Hamikdash mitzvahs. They're not mitzvahs for everybody. So on Chol HaMoed, you can't take it on Shabbos even in the Beis Hamikdash, because even though it's biblical, because it's only the rest of the days, it's not biblical elsewhere. But the first day, which for everyone is biblical, there they continue to allow you to take it on the first day. So we will continue with this tomorrow, but where we are right now is you can take, there's a concern of Shabbos carrying. Don't do lulav on Shabbos, but you can do it on the first day, which is biblical everywhere. That you can do it. The other days you can't do it even in the Beis Hamikdash. But the first day, the biblical mitzvah is going to override the concern that it might lead to carrying. So the question we obviously have to ask is, so why don't we do it on the first day? And why is shofar different? Shofar is always biblical on the first day. Why was shofar not also prohibited? Why was shofar prohibited on the first day and not lulav? So all of that, come back tomorrow. I'll leave you with the cliffhanger.
Linzer, it's not unusual for the Amoraim to offer an